In this lesson, we're going to take a look at the physical features of the United States, our first lesson on geography. Here we're looking at a physical map of the United States, which shows us overall, continent-wide, the features that we're going to highlight today. Starting in the east, we're taking a look at the Appalachian Mountains, which we'll talk about momentarily. Moving a little bit further west, we've got the Mississippi River. Then in the central part of the United States, we have the Great Plains. And moving still further west, we've got the Rocky Mountains chain, which is larger than the Appalachian Mountain chain. We also have the Great Lakes region to our northern Midwest. We're going to take a look at all of those today, but also take note of the fact that the United States is separated from most of the rest of the world by two oceans, the Atlantic Ocean in the east and the Pacific Ocean in the west. As this map indicates, the Appalachian Mountain chain stretches from Maine in the United States in the north through to northern Georgia and Alabama in the south. And it was the first barrier that the colonists ran into as they landed along the Atlantic coast. So it was between the Atlantic coast and the Appalachian Mountain chain that we have our first 13 colonies develop. We're going to spend a significant amount of time in this course talking about the Mississippi River, which you see highlighted on this map in dark blue, which stretches from the north in Minnesota and flows all the way south through the city of New Orleans today into the Gulf of Mexico. This river was a major transportation route for farmers, and still is, in fact, for farmers in this region. And you'll notice that there are a number of rivers that flow into the Mississippi. This map gives us a better look at that fact. All right, the Ohio River, the Tennessee River in the east, the Missouri River, which is a very large river system on its own in the west, along with some others, which allow for farmers to float their crops down to New Orleans on riverboats and then be loaded or transferred to ocean-going boats, where they would be taken, at least in colonial days and early American days, back to the markets along the East Coast. The Mississippi River is still today a very important transportation river for transportation, even today. Moving into the central part of the current United States, we've got the Great Plains region, which we can see here extends from the Canadian border in the north and goes all the way into Texas in the south. This was an area of major farming and ranching, and the line that delineates the two is shown here. The 100th meridian line is significant because there is adequate rainfall east of the line for agricultural crops, yet there is not enough rainfall west of the line really to grow crops that need more water than that region gets. However, you can see grass still grows, so that became an area initially for ranchers to raise cattle. Here we're looking at another map showing the Western Plains, the drier portion, which had some farming in it, particularly in the eastern side, and a lot of cattle raising in the western side. Notice, we'll take a look in the next slide, but the western boundary of the plains is where the Rocky Mountains starts. And that we're going to see in the next slide. The Rocky Mountains is the largest mountain chain in the United States, and you can see it extends all through North America, from Alaska all the way in the north, through western Canada, down through the western United States, and well into Mexico, and actually continues all the way through Central America and becomes the Andes Mountain region in South America. The Rocky Mountains are so tall that the rivers flow to the opposite side, meaning that they become the continental divide. Rivers east of the Rocky Mountains, like the Missouri River, which you can see here, flow east, and rivers west, I should say, to the Atlantic Ocean, and rivers that are located west of the Rockies that you see here flow out to the Pacific Ocean. And lastly, let's take a quick look at the Great Lakes. You see there are 5 lakes here. 4 of them are interconnected: Lake Erie, Lake Huron, Lake Michigan, Lake Superior. Lake Ontario and Lake Erie are connected by the Niagara River. However, because of the Niagara Falls, it's not as if you could take a boat from Lake Erie to Lake Ontario. The others you can take a boat through. This is going to become significant when we talk about the construction of the Erie Canal in the early 1800s, which will really allow for the development and settlement of the Great Lakes region. So just once again, back looking at the continental United States in full, we can see the Appalachian Mountains in the east, followed by the Mississippi River slightly to the west here. The central part of the United States today is the Great Plains. The western border of the Great Plains is the Rocky Mountains. We're going to look at each of these features through the course as they come up, as they become relevant in United States history. Now, the major point of this U.S. geography lesson is to look at the features of the major physical features of the United States, because we're going to look at the impact of geography on the settlement of the United States and the economy of specific regions. One more thing we need to talk about, though, is climate, because climate is going to affect take agriculture, for example. In an area where it's too cold to grow foodstuffs, you're not going to have foodstuffs grown. You'll have other things develop in its place for people to do. 2 things affect climate. One you can see on this map, and that's latitude. The 0-degree latitude line is the equator, which we see here in blue, going east-west around the world, if you will. And that region of the Earth, all the way around the Earth, is the warmest. And as we move away from the equator, either north of it or south of it, things begin to get cooler. The coldest points on the planet are the poles: the North Pole up the top, 90-degree north latitude, and the South Pole, 90-degree south latitude. So latitude, or your distance away from the equator, will affect the climate of your region, which is why, for example, in the continental United States, Florida is much warmer than, say, New York, particularly in the wintertime. Elevation is also something that affects climate. The higher you go, the cooler it is, and the colder the winters, the cooler the summers, the shorter the summers, the longer the winters, depending on where you are and how high you are up, which is why, say, people in New York City a couple of generations ago would escape to the Catskill Mountains fairly close by for the summers, because the summers in the mountains were cooler than in New York City. All right, this is going to have an impact on an area's economy, depending on the elevation of the area. It's just something to keep in mind, that as we go up, all right, things get colder, which is why at the tops of very tall mountains, you'll see ice caps on them or snow on them all year long, even in the middle of the summer. If you go to the Rocky Mountains, for example, near the tops of the Rocky Mountains, there's snow up there all year. All right, so you'll drive up in July near the tops of the mountains, get out and start walking around in the snow. It's not necessarily that it's snowing. It's simply that the snowfall is so significant over the wintertime, and it's so cool at the tops of the mountains, even in the summertime, that by late July and August, the snowpack that is there has not all completely melted yet. So then, to summarize, the major U.S. landforms from east to west are the Appalachian Mountains, the Mississippi River, the Great Plains in the central part of the United States, and the Rocky Mountains. The other takeaway from today's lesson is that climate is affected both by latitude, that's distance either north or south of the equator, and elevation. That brings us to the end of lesson 1.